Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's masterclass. This one's really special and actually really important. So whether you yourself are in a tumultuous relationship that you might be struggling to determine whether it's repairable or if you need to get out, or whether this is, maybe you're here for someone you know because you feel like maybe they're not safe. Maybe you're one of those people that just keeps ending up in all the wrong relationships and choosing the wrong guy over and over, and you can't seem to figure out what you're doing wrong or what's wrong with you. Um, Tonight, we're going to dive into all that because really and truly, we all want and need healthy relationships in our lives. And this is romantic relationships, friendships, partnerships, even our work relationships. We really should be striving to have healthy, productive relationships. But the problem is so often we end up in these toxic relationships or in this toxic cycle in relationships, and we feel like the burden is on us to repair these relationships. But sometimes the real problem is that we don't need to repair them. We actually need to find a safe way out. So the truth is, rom-coms aren't real. And we've been conditioned, most of us, over the course of our lifetime by watching movies and stories and the classic tropes of boy meets girl, girl is sad, triumph. There's, sadness and triumph, and then they live happily ever after. That after some turmoil and pain, somehow they come back together and they live happily ever after. And it's not that happily ever after doesn't exist. It's just that love isn't supposed to hurt. Love and healthy relationships are supposed to be built on communication and trust and safety. And unfortunately, in abusive relationships and toxic relationships, perpetrators and abusers often take for granted this stigma and this belief system that so many of us have, that love is supposed to be hard and love is supposed to hurt. So that's why we have a very special guest here tonight, Dave Markle. He is a retired SVU, or Special Victims Unit detective, and he has dedicated his entire career to giving survivors of sexual violence, domestic violence, and abuse a voice. He's also the host of the SASS podcast, Sexual Assault Survivor Stories podcast, and he speaks on stages all over, working with different administrations. He's even worked with the Army to help develop their sexual abuse and sexual harassment protocols as well. So this is a man who has absolutely dedicated his life and his know-how into understanding the cycle of abuse, understanding the psychographics of abuse, and helping us break this cycle and teach ourselves, to teach other women what to look out for and how to get out and how to stay safe. So welcome, Dave. Thank you so much for being here.
It's an honor. Thanks, Arcee.
Absolutely. So tonight, I want to kind of ask some tough questions and maybe even ask the questions that I now realize in hindsight I should have been asking. And I think questions that maybe people don't know to ask or are afraid to ask. So if you're game, I want to dive into this.
Absolutely. I'd love that. I think that's the best way to approach this is often kind of delve into whatever pops into our mind based on things that are being discussed. Because those
Absolutely.
things that pop into our mind are generally those questions that we haven't ever gotten answers to.
Yeah.
And so hopefully that's what tonight will be, is an opportunity for those who have tuned in person and those who are going to watch this later on will get some questions answered. And if not, there'll be links to be able to get a hold of either Arcee or myself, and I'm available to answer those questions. So thank you, Arcee. This is really a pleasure and an honor to be here.
Awesome. Well, thank you. It's always a pleasure, Dave. We always have such a great conversation too. So I'm excited. So I want to start actually where um, I think that this is an experience that unfortunately a lot of women have had, and kind of falls into the classic trope of the why are we always attracted to bad boys? Or a lot of times after too many failed relationships and too much turmoil and stress, we start asking ourselves, like, what's wrong with me? Why am I always picking the wrong guys? And I think this is really important to dive into. So, Dave, why do we pick the bad boys? What's going on here?
It's an interesting question, and it's one when we talk about the dynamics of our own personalities and why we do what we do. Everything we do is based on what our brain feels like we need at the moment. A lot of people grow up with this idea that whatever they're told not to do is something they should go check out and see why shouldn't I do this? Why should I stay away from the bad boy? And it almost triggers or activates this compulsion to go find out what it is that I'm being told is wrong. What's wrong with these bad boys? And it's an adrenaline rush. It's intriguing to go be with somebody who's breaking the rules or living in a lifestyle that doesn't seem to fit into that normal, you know, mold of the good boy image. And I think what we should kind of start off with here, RC, is the fact that we will be using the the common concept and belief because it's true that usually it's women who are in these relationships. Very few men suffer from domestic violence and stay in those relationships because we live in a male dominated society. It's easy for a man to get out of a domestic violence relationship. Not easy, but easier.
Mhm.
And so I think it's important that we kind of recognize that that's what we'll be talking about tonight mostly is women victims. And
Yeah.
so if we look at that dynamic of why young girls especially start gravitating towards boys, young men that seem to be intriguing to them in certain ways and have that bad boy image, it's because they're just seeking out that which they don't know and want to know more about because they've been told to stay away from that, or that's their lifestyle image that they grew up with. That's
I
part of
agree. Yeah,
it.
I think that that's a big part of it. I think there's really sort of two camps to that too, right? If you've grown up in a healthy relationship with your, watching your parents, whether they're together or not, right? You can have happily divorced and very healthy, separate parent households or together parent households. But if you've grown up in a healthy relationship and seeing healthy relationships, that gives you a much better foundation to have healthier relationships. um, and then if you've grown up in the opposite where you've seen and all you've known is unhealthy relationships, of course that trains us to seek out
Yeah.
that because we're groomed to that. One thing I will say that I learned, um, interestingly the hard way, was that I thought healthy was boring anytime that I would date a nice guy, um, or a healthy relationship that was moving at a healthy pace, I thought I was bored. I was like, oh, I'm bored. He's too nice. He's boring. He has no personality.
Right.
But
And
what
that goes back to what I was saying is that adrenaline rush. It's something different. It's something exciting. It's something new. It's something that we maybe haven't experienced, but if we have, we're attracted to that because it feels exciting. It gives us that rush of, a higher heart rate and the infatuation aspect of all of that. Yeah,
I think that's,
absolutely.
we often confuse love for that that adrenaline rush.
Mhm.
We know that love is supposed to be, like I said, the movies teach us that love is supposed to be this heart-pounding butterflies in your stomach kind of thing. And um, I think too that a good portion of what's happening in our bodies when we're afraid and when we're excited is actually the same thing. So it can kind of trick us, right?
True, that's true. I mean, those chemicals that are released, those hormones that come out of both what excites us and what makes us fearful are very, very similar and have the same effects on our bodies. The other aspect to this too is that we're not all free of trauma. As we grow up, we experience different types of traumas, and sometimes that bad boy image or that effect is something we're attracted to because we're used to it.
Yeah.
That's my lifestyle. That's my go-to. And sometimes also it can be that somebody who is traumatized or who has been living in an emotional upset mindset for much of their life will look at that person as kind of the knight in shining armor. I'll save you from what you've been involved in. I'm tough enough and man enough to take care of you. I
Mhm.
will I will envelop you in this relationship that actually I can help control and be in charge of, take care of you.
That's the we often characterize, and we can open this door. This is a can of worms that I'm about to crack open a little bit here, and we don't have to dive deep into this. It might be a conversation for another time. But oftentimes, when you see that dynamic happening, we as a society love to shame women, and we like to say, oh, that girl's got daddy issues, right?
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
that is, it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate that we shame the girl for having daddy issues when in fact the
Right.
subject matter of that exact statement is a father who wasn't there in
Yep.
whatever capacity, right?
Yep.
So I always kind of think that's funny that we're shaming the girl for having those issues when in fact it indicates the specific trauma that she's experienced. Now, it doesn't necessarily excuse her own choices and behaviors if she continues to perpetuate a cycle, but it definitely explains or can offer at least some explanation or a foundation to why she might be making these subconscious choices and might be more easily susceptible to this cycle.
And
So,
our society is male dominated, and our society then, because of that aspect, can shame women a whole lot more easily than they will be willing to shame themselves for having deficiencies, defects, problems as they try to parent.
yeah.
And yeah, it's a whole lot easier to blame women than it is to blame men, because women are that they're socialized to accept that shame, to accept that blame, and to not reject the male domination of this is the way society works, and this is why you're the way you are.
Mhm. We're getting a comment here too from someone in the audience saying that it's the single mom trope, this idea that she's a single mom, you know. So I agree. I do think that yeah, there is a societal bias against women naturally in the situation. And again, that's a can of worms, and I know that we could probably do a deep dive on that. Something similar in that vein, oftentimes, is you hear, and I don't know from the law enforcement side, from you being sort of behind the scenes in that, how much you've experienced this or seen this happen amongst maybe your peers or colleagues. I have seen, not personally, but I have experienced through some of my clients. Um, recollections of their own personal experience, and I've also seen it in social media and in other places where let's say you have a man and a woman and there happens to be some sort of domestic violence situation and law enforcement has responded. There is this question that gets asked, and it I can't understand it. I have tried so hard to look at it from different perspectives, and when a woman is explaining or expressing to an officer that the man has in some way there's some sense of abuse or violence, whether it was, physical, emotional, whatever. um the officer often asks the woman, well, what did you do to piss him off?
Right.
And I'm like it blows my mind because I am trying to understand it. At first my instinct is to be really angry at the man who is an officer who's there to respond to maintain the peace and make sure that there is safety. And yet somehow in asking that question, I don't know, is that a question that police are trained to ask? Or is that just a man from his bias and his perspective trying to understand how the situation can escalate? And I'm a female, I'm not law enforcement, and I have walked in the shoes as a victim. So I'm having a really hard time. Help me understand this one, Dave.
I'll do my best. It certainly isn't a question that law enforcement is trained to ask. It's a totally inappropriate question, but it tells me, and I've heard it, I've worked right alongside, shoulder to shoulder, with officers, patrol officers, and detectives alike who often ask that question. To me, that speaks volumes of that officers, that law enforcement person's personal life and what they feel entitled to. And that to me is an entitlement question that a female, again, being subservient to men. That's the way we're raised. That's the way we're socialized. Still, to this day, it's 2025. There's been huge, massive equal rights amendment issues, and women speak out and stand up for each other, but we still have massive numbers of domestic violence cases and massive issues in our society of putting women down and putting them in second places and blaming them if they act in a certain way. And that's certainly the answer to your question, in my perspective, is that person has been raised in a mindset of chauvinism, what we used to call male chauvinists, this idea that men have the right to not be pissed off or bothered or interfered with in their lifestyle by a woman. It's fine for them to interject their lifestyle, their manlyhood, their concept of what it means to be in control of a situation onto a woman, a lesser strong personality, or someone who's been socialized in such a way as to uh, do what men want them to do. It just, that question amplifies to me that person's mindset that they don't think women have rights, and they diminish a woman's capacity to have the right to be who they want to be, to do what they want to do. So if the man is upset, if the male partner, and this goes to same-sex situations too, we have those same dynamics. Someone is in power, someone is in control, usually in a relationship. Very rarely do we see equality in relationships. But there's someone who has that mindset that you better not tick me off. You better not do something that upsets me. You better not do anything that I tell you that you shouldn't do. And I've seen even men who have lists of things that they give to their wives or their significant others. This is how you will act. This is what you will do. This is what I expect when I come home. This is how the house should look. This is how the children should be treated, et cetera, et cetera. And if any of those are violated, then that mentality of a cop saying, what did you do to piss him off, is almost like saying, which one of those things on the list did you screw up?
Wow. Yeah, that and like I said, thankfully that was not a question that was asked of me in any of my specific experiences. But the fact is that, like I said, when my clients tell me, this is, I've heard it so many times, it doesn't surprise me anymore. But like I said,
Mm-hmm.
it still blows my mind because I can't wrap my brain around it. But it does make sense what you're saying is that when you come into, whether you are law enforcement, or a friend or the brother of, or whoever, if you come in with this bias, that is what's going to direct your questions and your approach to the situation. So thank you for that insight. Absolutely. Doesn't make me feel any better, but at least I have a much better understanding now of at
But
least why.
yeah, and I think there's something that needs to be addressed beyond that, and that is, what do we do with those police officers? What do we do with those officials? Whether it's a police officer, whether it's a judge, whether it's a prosecutor who has those. Maybe the police officer did everything they were supposed to do and were empathic and amazingly good to the victim, and it gets passed on to a prosecutor, and the prosecutor
Yeah.
reads through the report and goes through it and has a as a sit down first initial contact with that victim and asks that same question. So it's not just police officers, it's prosecutors, it's judges, it's and when I say judges, I'm talking all the way down from a magistrate who may be
Yeah.
at a municipal level, all the way up to Supreme Court justices who have this mentality that men are superior to women. What do we do with that? How do we handle that? And whenever I encountered that, I'll tell you, I'll be honest. When I encountered that, I'd talk to that police officer and say, maybe you shouldn't come on domestic violence calls. If you're in a big enough department, if that's your mentality, don't respond to those, or ask somebody else to handle it, or do the background stuff, collecting evidence, because some of those officers may be very, very good at police officers at say property crimes,
Mhm.
auto thefts,
Mhm.
um, other types of assaults, gang issues, and things like that, drugs. They may be great at that. It's just this issue with domestic violence that has its own set
It's like
of
missing
dynamics.
that. Yeah, it's like it's missing that bedside manner or that
Mhm.
specific perspective, or even it doesn't, and there's a lot of talk now about like the male gaze and the female gaze. And I don't believe that there's a male gaze and a female gaze. I believe that there is that the gaze in which is whatever your bias is. And it is that societal upbringing that we have that it's like a subset of rules.
And that question isn't, what did you do to piss him off? Isn't just restricted to the dynamics of domestic violence, but that overlaps into sexual assault and rape cases. In that, the man has the right to this type of thing. What were you wearing? How much had you had to drink? Why were
Exactly.
you being so flirtatious? It's the same mentality of this is your fault, and that's
It's the
victim blaming.
victim blaming. It's victim
All
blaming.
it is.
And there is a fine line that we often, and we talk about this, in case anyone doesn't know, Dave is on the board here at Survivor School as well, and on the ethics committee, and we talk about this often, is this line between what is the line of victim blaming and asking the victim to take responsibility for their outcome. And we know that the best outcomes happen when we take responsibility for our outcome. The best outcomes happen when the survivor has agency, has a sense of agency and a sense of ability to self-efficacy, to act and be in control of the choices that they're going to make. But when we come from a place of victimhood, especially when we're automatically the people that are there that are supposed to be there to help us, um, come in at us with this sort of the victim blaming type questions, the what are you wearing, where are you drinking, what did you do to piss him off kind of questions,
Mhm.
automatically puts us on the defensive. And it's very hard for us to even feel like we do have control over our own choices and our own actions. It makes it very difficult for us to feel like we have agency and self-efficacy to get an outcome, because it feels like everyone is telling us it is our fault. We
Mhm.
did
And
this.
that's a societal bias, as you've mentioned. To me, and I know to you because we've had these discussions, as you've mentioned, the there's a bright line between victim blaming and victim responsibility in a certain circumstance. I don't have the question in my mind about, where do you cross that line, and how delicate do you have to be with victims and survivors when we're approaching this, because we're educated about the dynamics of domestic violence. We're educated about the dynamics of sexual assault. And part of being educated in those dynamics is knowing that there is an element of responsibility that a person who's victimized has to come to a realization of. And it's not it's completely separate from saying, if you had not done this, you would not have been assaulted by your significant other.
Right.
Had you done this? So there's this blame situation of, you did something you shouldn't have done, or you didn't do something you should have done. And that's a whole lot different in the victim blaming realm, and that lens and that understanding and that bias, than, hey survivor, hey victim, let's let's educate ourselves on the dynamics of what a perpetrator mindset is. What do perpetrators do? How do they think? Why do they do what they do? And separate that from, who am I and why am I the way I am, in terms of being susceptible to this and doing the same thing over and over and over again every time I see this cycle of violence, which we'll get into, developing in that the honeymoon phase is over. He's done being nice and apologizing for his violence. Things have calmed down. Now we're in this tension building phase. And what do I do? What am I doing in this phase that I could change, that might not not to try and eliminate the domestic violence on his part, but what can I do to eliminate myself from this situation?
Yeah, and one of the things I want to be super clear about, and this is the most blunt way that we can put this, um, and I think that it's clear and it cuts to the chase. It's not your fault, but it is your problem to solve. And it sucks as the victim that we get this extra burden of this problem to solve, and we can be all kinds of pissed off about that. We're absolutely allowed to be pissed off that we have an extra burden on our shoulders. But first and foremost, it is not your fault. It's not your fault, but it is your responsibility. It is your problem. It is a problem that falls on your plate, and it is your responsibility to handle it. Now, that doesn't mean you're alone. It doesn't mean that there are no resources and that there is not help. And that's really why we're here. So I know that comes across as tough love, but it is one of the it's one of the realities I think that when we are stuck in that cycle of violence, which I really do want to get into, and I also want to get into this other component that you talk about as well, which is the power and control wheel. So actually, let's just go ahead and dive into that now, because I know we could have this conversation for hours and hours, but I really want people to understand. I want them to be able to recognize the signs and the symptoms. How do you know? How do you know you're in a an abusive relationship? How do you like, what do we look for, Dave? How would we know that this is
I,
not just a rough patch in our relationship or a personality conflict or, just something we need to work out in therapy?
I think that's a great question. And it's impossible for me to memorize all of the dynamics of this, but I can tell you that that question has some pretty specific answers. And it's understanding what abuse is. It's understanding perpetrator mindset. And a lot of times we as victims or survivors who may be more susceptible to being victimized again as a survivor, maybe we're out of the situation, but we're still more susceptible having been through it once before, is just understanding that if you're being pinched in a mean way, that can be the start of something early on in the relationship, or just a slight push or nudge, or a soft punch. Hey, knock that off, kind of thing that accompanies that. But some of those other signs and symptoms that you might be in a relationship that you should probably be particularly aware of are things like those things that I mentioned: pinch, slap, hit, soft push, nudge, things like that. But is he consistently started putting you down? Has he consistently started taking power away from you and telling you what you can and cannot do in terms of where you cannot go, who you can or cannot be with, who you can even make phone calls to, what you can or cannot do with your money? This power and control wheel that is very common. It's been around since about the early to mid 70s. I think it came out of the Duluth, Minnesota model, where a group of women kind of that had been through various stages of domestic violence kind of gathered and banded together and came up with these and said, what was your relationship like? And they just started making comparisons and contrasts and came up with these types of things that are very specific to what it means for a personality who has to have power and control in a relationship. So the things that I've already mentioned are physical, but also, as you can see on this wheel, the using economic abuse. So preventing someone from getting or keeping a job. I don't, boy, that rings a really loud bell in my head, because I remember my own father telling my mother she couldn't work. That she wanted to go back to school and become a teacher, and he was absolutely not. You are not going to do that. Luckily, she was strong enough and did. But things like controlling the checkbook, giving that person in the relationship an allowance or not, taking all the money, taking her money that she may have brought into the relationship, or if she does manage to get a job, that paycheck that she gets, he's in control of. He takes it from her. He says, I'll take care of this. The other things that I think are significant about this wheel are things that I've talked about already, and that is this whole mentality of entitlement, and the way we are in society with a male-dominated society is that using male privilege aspect. And let's look at those really quick. Treating her like a servant. She is subservient to me. She will do what I say, what I tell her to do. again, comes back to that question you asked, why do police officers, why do some people ask, what did you do to take him off? That's a male privilege kind of question. They make the decisions. They are the ones who are in charge. They're the ones that make the rule list in that relationship. Some of the scarier ones are the using children as pawns in that relationship. Again, threatening the children, abusing the children in front of mom. And when mom tries to intercede or interrupt or protect the child, there's a lot of danger for that mom, for the person who's trying to stop that. Using the children as spies, using the children as go-between in the communication aspect of it, and telling the children they have to report back to him about what mom's done all day long. Where has she been? What has she done? Who was she with? Those types of things.
So much of this, and it's great to have this list, and I will make sure that this ends up when the replay goes out as well. We'll make sure that this ends up we attach it. There's a document that people can download and get and have access to this as well, just to reference, because sometimes these are things that we tell our friends, or, we call our mom, you're never going to believe what he's doing right now, blah, blah, blah. And mom's like, oh, that's fine. Boys will be boys, blah, blah, blah. Right. And oftentimes it's because they grew up with this, and they may have grown up under the same, or their relationships may have looked a lot like this. And we often deny that we're in abusive relationships because there's shame around that. We know that it's a scary thought to have, and all of that. But when I look at all of these, sort of the different categories, it really is about controlling resources, whether that's financial resources, resources or sources to get our needs met. And what this all boils down to is putting us into survival mode, emotionally, physically, and mentally, into a state where we can't plan ahead, where we can't think about anything but our immediate safety or meeting their immediate needs so that we remain safe. This is the isolation, looking at the isolation tactic. If the abuser takes away your support system, so much easier to control you, right?
Yeah.
Putting you down. If they take away your own internal sense of self and self-confidence, it's so much easier to control someone who feels like they are less than. And obviously intimidation and physical violence and things like that as well.
It's amazing. I want to interject here too, that this dynamic doesn't just apply to interpersonal relationships. We see this in friendship relationships. We see this in the church. We see this in work and school relationships. I mean, the whole mentality of an employer having power and control over the employees. These are just some of the highlights of the unhealthy aspects of what it means to be in control and have power. And that's the scary part of it, is that it's just a part of human nature that somebody is going to have more power than the other in almost every circumstance that you can relate to and that you've been involved in your whole life. But when you get home, when you're inside those four walls of what your house is or what your living situation is, this gets amplified. And from the perpetrator mentality, what happens in this house stays in this house mentality, that whole Las Vegas things, or what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. This, though, is so much more dangerous and unhealthy. And there are, unfortunately, as you mentioned, law enforcement personnel, judges, others that look at this, and they are so conditioned by our society that this is the norm. It's accepted. And that's where we have to be careful. I've worked with law enforcement personnel and even people in the prosecutorial end of things who think that domestic violence is only between the two partners that are involved in that. I've heard And I remember a specific detective that I worked with who said, I will not intervene in anything that goes on in a domestic violence relationship. That's between them. And it doesn't affect anybody but them. That is so wrong. And we can talk about this, or we could go on all night about the impacts that domestic violence have on our society and how domestic violence moves into the workplace and makes workplace one of the most dangerous places for a woman besides the home, and how there's almost no escape for women who are involved in relationships where power and control are a huge aspect of that relationship.
So one of the things that I think might be coming up for a lot of people, and this is a hot topic right now, it's a buzzword, it is a trending hashtag on every platform, and this has been for quite some time, is the narcissist.
Oh
Um,
man, it's
now,
the flavor of the month, right?
yeah, right. So there is what's called the dark triad, and that is narcissism, psychopathy, or so psychopath or sociopath, whether they're violent or nonviolent, and Machiavellianism. And if you meet someone who has the dark triad, they are every single one of their relationships is based on the cycle of violence and the power and control. So one thing I want to mention here is a huge ideology of my own and my own success in my healing journey and everything that Survivor School is built on. And Dave, this is conversations you and I have had these conversations so much, is that while yes, there is an importance that we need to put on the perpetrator and identifying the characteristics of the perpetrator and understanding who these people are so that we can see them coming. One thing that we do not do is we don't give energy to them, right? So you're not ever going to see me sitting around talking about how horrible narcissists are and all of the things that they do and all the ways that they've wronged us, because I really do believe that that's putting the energy and our efforts into the wrong place. And when you are a survivor, whether it's of, whether you have complex post-traumatic stress because of long-term lived experience of high stress situations, or it's a single incident or a single relationship that has maybe been in this cycle that you're trying to get out of. Either way, we have limited energy. We have limited executive function, limited capacity for things. And I promise you, the best way to spend that energy and that effort is on yourself and understanding what you need to do and who you need to be and the resources that you need. It doesn't invalidate that, yes, they have these characteristics and yes, they have done these things to you and those things are real. But if we put the attention on the victim or the survivor in whatever state they're in, right? Hopefully we get them to a state of survivorship. But a lot of times people are stuck in the victimhood might be the right word for it. It's not victim mentality, right? But having been victimized or being victimized is a real phase in this.
Absolutely.
Not going to discredit that. So, I know that we could probably spend hours and hours talking about the narcissist or the dark triad and all the characteristics of these people that may be the abusers. But I don't want to waste our time here because I think it's really important that we kind of get to really what people can do about this. And I really want to start talking about the cycle of violence because I think this was huge and eye-opening for me. It's I
Yeah.
I love
I,
it so much. And yeah, so that's why we're not going to go deep dive on that, by the way, why we're not going to go and talk about all the horrible things that, and I get it. It's trending and people want to know, but we really want to talk about action. So, Dave, could you tell us a little bit, and I'm going to go ahead and see if I can pull up an image real quick so people can see this, but I want to, you and I have talked about this, but I really do want to talk about, we've referenced it a few times, the cycle of violence. And I want people watching this to look for the characteristics in their own relationship that might be fitting into the cycle. Because when you're in it, it's you can't see it. You can't see the forest for the trees so often. When you're deep in it, it's so hard to see this cycle. And everyone else around you might see pieces and parts of this cycle, but the abusers do a very good job of isolating it. So even if they let other people see components of the cycle, very few of your family members, friends, mutual friends, you and your relationship, especially if it's with the abuser, they're going to keep different groups of friends, and those different groups of friends are going to see different sides of them, um, in different sides of your relationship. So I think this is really important to talk about. I'm sure.
I will just start by talking about the cycle of violence by kind of identifying what I consider the most common is a three-part. Some cycles people
I
have,
usually
there's a
reference a four
four-part.
part, but I think, yeah, the three part, and we can talk about the four part in between, but I think this one might be, no, that's not a good
And
one.
I think to people who aren't familiar with the cycle of violence or who may be experiencing the cycle of violence and not recognizing it, wonder, well, where does it start? Which part of the cycle of violence happens first?
Mm,
And I think maybe we should think about the beginning of the relationship. When you first entered into that relationship, what was that relationship like? Well, the majority of relationships start off with a mutual respect and this kind of flowery infatuation, love kind of thing where I want to be with you all the time. I want to be around you all the time. And that's both from both sides of the relationship. They the two act that way, but eventually through time and the natural progression of the way our brains work and the way chemicals work in our brains, that infatuation eventually dies down. And that's when somebody who does have power and control issues may start to exhibit some of the signs and symptoms that we're talking about that are power and control things. So it probably usually starts off in terms of the abuse part of the relationship with something very small, but it can develop into severe abuse very rapidly, or it may take months or years for this to develop through time. But the three main parts are the explosion or abuse, the attacks, the threats, the danger, harmful part of domestic violence, punching, hitting, slapping, strangulation, um, even so far as attempted homicide type things. Um,
yes.
as we're looking at this image that you put up, it's the incident. In the one that I'm looking at, it's called the explosion. So it's verbal,
Yeah.
emotional, and physical abuse. It's abuse that is out of control. It's abuse that's extremely dangerous, usually. But that is almost always followed up by the second aspect of that, and that's the reconciliation or the what some people call the honeymoon phase. And then that can eventually go into the tension building phase. Um, the fourth part that sometimes is left out of a three-part cycle of violence is that calmness. That where you see this dove holding the olive branch, and there's the part of the relationship that's generally calm, peaceful, and even this little uh, subtitle calls it the honeymoon phase.
Yeah. This is this and there's probably a different graphic, and maybe on the replay we can put a different graphic in. I always learned it as a four part as four parts, not three, in that the tension building and the explosion, which again, maybe these graphics aren't, a little bit of tension building here, a little bit of explosion, but that the tension building and the explosion are two distinct phases. And the
Absolutely.
apology phase and the honeymoon phase are two distinct phases. But very oftentimes, and we're in the thick of a relationship that does this, we don't feel the tension. We don't see it. We're just programmed to brace ourselves for it, but we can't recognize that it's happening in the moment. But what we do remember is the extremes. We remember the explosion, and then we remember the honeymoon phase. And you're right, when these relationships start, and we talked a little bit about this, when someone might be in a more vulnerable state, and someone comes along who's like, don't worry, I'll rescue you, right? Someone who is
Mhm.
lonely, even as simple as like loneliness. Maybe they haven't been in a relationship for a while, or maybe they're going through something, and they meet someone who can very easily recognize this vulnerability. That abuser may absolutely love bomb you, They may
Mm.
throw everything at you that you need to hear, buying you flowers and taking you on dates and meeting your needs and listening intently to everything that you have to say because they're really looking for fuel for their explosion, for their tension, their explosion.
Right.
They're looking for all of the things that they may need later to set off a bomb. And so that honeymoon phase really starts with this, at the beginning, it's this very big experience. The honeymoon phase is very, very big, and the tension might be something tiny, like you said, the pinch, the pick at you, the oh, you're gonna wear that, ugh. Like a subtle dig, and the tension, it builds, and then the explosion might be something. It might be the couple's first fight, right? Okay, every couple has a fight, right? Everybody has disagreements. That's not necessarily an unhealthy thing. What will then happen very often in after that first fight, the abuser will actually be the one to apologize. And then everything goes back into the honeymoon phase and it's great. But this second time around in the honeymoon phase shrinks a little bit. And then the tension happens again. And then the next explosion is like a little bit bigger. And this goes on for a little while. And one of the things I really wanted to point out, Dave, and I would love for you to expand on this, is that there is a very critical point in this cycle where it begins with the abuser apologizing and being the one to say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, my bad. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm a horrible person. I didn't mean it. I promise I'll change. I promise I'll change. I promise I'll change." The critical point is there is a time when an a big explosion happens, and these don't necessarily have to be physical, right? These can be
No.
very often they're not. Very often they're just these verbal disagreements. Um, the victim in these cases are very often confused and gaslit and they're like, I don't even know what happened. Like they're often blindsided by the explosion. That critical turning point is when the abuser doesn't apologize, but they expect the victim now to apologize. And I think that
Mhm.
that's a really crucial turning point in these relationships because the first phase of it when the abuser is the one that's apologizing, he's grooming the victim into here's the 4 steps that we follow. Everything's great. Then there's tension. Then we explode and then we apologize. But when they don't apologize, we have been conditioned as the victim that the way to get back to the honeymoon phase and safety is to apologize. And as soon as we take on the role of the one who is apologetic, I think that that becomes one of the most dangerous phases in this relationship. So I would love if you could expand on that a little bit. I did not mean to make that a diatribe, but I know that is such an important component that I'm not sure that people fully understand.
It is an important component, but there are other important components that question raised that I want to address in getting to the answer of your
Okay.
question. That is that the 3-part cycle of violence that I was referring to takes that reconciliation phase and the calm phase and combines them into one.
Mm,
So from tension building to incident to reconciliation slash honeymoon phase, then more tension building. The other aspect that I want to address is that the cycle of violence or the cycle of, you've just put up one called the cycle of abuse, isn't always there in every power and control situation, in every domestic violence uh, relationship. And that's a confusing part to people. In fact, I've heard some experts who say we shouldn't even talk about the cycle of violence. I think we should because it's very, very common in a phase of a relationship. But as a relationship matures and goes on, and the power and control issues become more and more amplified, oftentimes the cycle of violence becomes a 2-phase
mm,
cycle instead of even a 3-phase. And that 2-phase is the explosion and tension building, explosion and tension. And there is no apology
right.
whatsoever. But there is that phase, as you've brought up, where the power and control issue, that person changes the dynamic from going from the reconciliation, I'm sorry, love bomb honeymoon phase to uh, this and apologizing to this mindset again of entitlement that, you know what, it's I'm not always the one that's wrong. You did things that caused me, again, going back to that, what did you do to piss him off? That mentality can actually permeate the abuser's mindset also. And so they are far enough along in the relationship, they've had enough power and control that they are no longer afraid after they blow up that that victim may leave the relationship, which is why the apology occurs in the first place. Is basically, if you boil it all down, there's that immediacy fear aspect on their part of they're going to report me, they're going to tell somebody, or they're going to leave me. And so I need to do all I can to make sure that they stay and that they know that I'm never going to do this again. And I'm going to resolve the issue and fix the problem, which is me, and I'll change. But through time and going through that cycle over and over again, that kind of evolves into, hey, wait a minute, I'm not the one who needs to apologize here. I'm not the one who caused this. You know how to push my buttons, and this was you did this, not me. And so it transfers almost in its entirety to the victim, and the expectation on the part of somebody who has the power and control of saying, you did this, you need to apologize to me. It goes into the other phase that I was going to say, that doesn't last long. It just goes from the the explosion, the abuse cycle, to the tension building, the abuse to the tension. There is no apology on either part.
And I think that's what's really interesting is if we were to look at this, you know, the we know when we meet someone and they're love bombing, oh, that's okay. Now we know because everybody's talking about narcissists and red flags and things like that, that okay, that's a red flag. We can maybe recognize that in the beginning. What sucks about that is all your friends can be telling you, dude, that's a red flag, and we're like, but it feels so good. Like, why wouldn't I want him to shower me with gifts and flowers and right? So, but when you think about it, if it does start as a 4 phase sequence, and then very quickly the apologies drop off, and then the honeymoon phase drops off, and then it does just become tension explosion, tension explosion. That's when the cycle has expanded so much, right? The explosions get bigger, the apologies get smaller, the honeymoon phases get smaller until they disappear. That's if that's the point in your relationship where you are realizing that something is wrong, then you are pretty deep into it. So, in the interest of time, because like I said, I knew we could talk for hours about this. We are definitely approaching the end of the time here. Um, let's talk about now if somebody really does recognize that maybe they are in a situation that is not healthy, and hopefully we've offered enough evidence and information that these relationships are beyond repair. This is not something that you can fix. You cannot fix this in another person. In fact, the only way that that person can be fixed is if they themselves not just take responsibility and come to you with an apology and I'll never do it again, but the only way that they can change themselves is actually outside of the relationship. They cannot do it while in a relationship. And they have to take the onus of that. They have to seek out therapy and support and whatever else they need in order to do that. It can never happen within a relationship. So, that being said, now that we've come to this place where we know if any of these things are happening, regardless of what phase, whether it's in the 4-part phase or the 3-part phase or the 2-part phase, how do we get out, Dave?
Well, first of all, we have to admit that, and I don't know that admit's a good word, recognize in our own selves that this is an irreparable situation. And unfortunately, it's not uncommon for victims to try and get out of these situations when it is just tension and explosion and tension and they're living in this horrific lifestyle of abuse where sometimes there is not even a tension building phase. It's just constant abuse, verbal, pets being abused, children being abused. It's just constant.
Mhm.
And there's no remorse, there's no fear on the part of the perpetrator. The only time they don't act that way towards their victim is when they're out in public and know that they'll be seen and arrested.
Yeah.
And that's the other really interesting part about offender mentality. Oftentimes they'll say, well, I can't help it, I have anger issues, I have this issue. No, they can control it, because when the police show up, they're like, it's her fault. And they come across as this loving, wonderful, perfect husband, and they act the same way out in public. So absolutely they can control it. They're not abusive in public. So there has to be this recognition and the understanding on the victim's part that I've got to get out of this, because it could lead to a very dangerous situation of serious bodily injury or lethality. And that's where a lot of times these relationships go. Sometimes they stay in this horrific, violent relationship for long, many, many, many years. But at some point, victims try and get out. And the unfortunate statistic is that most victims try to get out of these relationships 6 to 7 to 8 times before they're finally successful and actually leave this relationship. The
And
other,
I
go
do
ahead.
want to point out too that even if these aren't violent relationships, they're trying to exit a lot of times, even if it's emotional or financial abuse,
Mhm.
there is still a danger when trying to exit. And that's when you are the most vulnerable. Is that right?
It is. And it's kind of a scary statistic. You're 75 to 85 times more susceptible to serious bodily injury or death when you leave that relationship. And the latest research shows that that danger level of 75 times to 85 times more susceptible to danger of serious bodily injury or death remains even after you get out of that situation for around 2 to 3 years before it starts going down and that lethality aspect starts diminishing. So that's a very, very dangerous, scary time. And so the preparation and thought process that you have about leaving that relationship has to be thorough, has to be complete, has to be well thought out. And there are many, many aspects of that. I really encourage viewers and people who are sitting here listening to this now that if you are trying to leave that relationship, take all the advice you can from all the websites. If you can get on the computer safely, either at home, if not, and that's the other scary thing, is that so many abusers actually put spyware on their computer. So victims may not even know, even though there's a site that has an escape button that they can get out of that site if the perpetrator comes near or tries
Mhm.
to see what they're looking at. They can hit the escape button, but that doesn't mean that it's gone from the computer. There's oftentimes on perpetrators' parts spyware that's installed, and so they can go back and look at what you've been looking at anyway.
And I would recommend, as sort of a little aside, if there's any opportunity to get to a public library,
Mhm.
that is one
Public
place.
library, a friend's computer, a computer at church, a computer somewhere where that person doesn't have the
Access.
capacity to spy on you or see what you were looking at. That's number one. Become educated on what it means to put together an escape plan. But that escape plan has to also envelop what is happening at the moment, because you're at a high risk oftentimes while the domestic abuse is occurring. So you need to be aware of staying away from certain parts of the house. For instance, where weapons are stored, where knives are located, like in kitchens. Try and stay away from the kitchen if at all possible. Try and maneuver yourself to a window that you know you can open and get out of if you have to, or a door. Put yourself in a physical position during this abusive, traumatic behavior that you can escape if at all possible. And that means even if children or pets have to be left behind so that you can go get help, so that you can save yourself and get away, then do that. But that's an important aspect that many times is overlooked in these, what do I do if I'm trying to leave this relationship? Well, let's first address what we do while the danger is existent in that home. But past that, how do we get ready? What does our safety plan look like? What does it mean? Have a phone on you at all times, and have even old cell phones. keep them charged. And here's why. Going
So
back about 10 to 12 years, old cell phones can be used to call 911, even if there are no minutes available on a plan, even if that phone's not connected to a plan, those phones have the capacity to call 911. So have a cell phone stashed, several of them around the house that are charged all the time. If you can do that safely, and I'll put the caveat on here in here, don't do any of this if it puts you at a higher risk.
right.
Um, and get as much outside help as you can. And that's the other aspect of this. Have friends, neighbors, um, colleagues, family members that know how dangerous the situation is on constant call, so that if you need to reach out to them or you need to run to them, you can. And I would even go so far as, if the perpetrator is away from you and you have the opportunity to go make connections with some neighbors, I know it's embarrassing, I know it's hard, but you might need to tell somebody, hey, I'm in a situation where I could be in danger and my life may depend upon you if I come running down the street to your house for you to call 911 for me. I'm trying to get out of the relationship, but I need you to be there for me. And you may not know that person very well, but hopefully they are somebody that you can trust enough to not go back to that perpetrator and tell them, hey, your
That is true.
significant
And
other
there
just
is
killed
always
me.
that fear, especially in a lot of abusive relationships. You will find that the abuser, if they see you becoming friendly with the neighbor, they may try to interrupt that relationship and also maintain control of that relationship, right? It's controlling resources.
Yeah.
You will another thing that I learned, through my own personal experience is it took me a long time to trust this, but people do want to help you. It doesn't feel like it, like I said, a lot of times there's shame and embarrassment around things. And you will
No,
find some people that are like, "Ah, I don't want to get involved in that." But I
right.
promise you that the majority of people actually they do want to help other people.
Right.
And as survivors and when we're in survival mode, we're very skeptical of others. But if you can trust that, genuinely, that is I found it to be true. Um, a lot of it does have to do with how you approach them and what you say, obviously, so that you don't completely alarm them and put them in the defensive. And we can talk about that on another call. We can talk about
Yeah,
that
we
in
could.
master class.
There's so much to talk about in this safety plan kind of concept. I mean, we could even get down to the nitty gritty of developing code words with neighbors and code words with employers and colleagues at work, so that you don't even have to tell them all the details of what's going on. If you drop that code word, they know to call law enforcement, or they know to keep you safe and keep you away from the fact that your significant other that's abusive may be coming to visit you at work. You need
And you know what, Dave, I want to take this opportunity to, for anybody that's watching, I will make sure that in the description below there is an ability to directly contact either Dave or myself. And if this is something that you genuinely need to do, if you need a safety plan and you need to create one in a way, that you're safe while creating your safety plan, we'll make sure that we are available, that you can directly reach out to us, and we can help you do that in a way that puts you in less danger.
And
Normally we
one of
workshop things.
one of our participants even just mentioned that there are code emojis that you could use on cell phones. And I think that's an amazing aspect of this, something I hadn't thought of or heard of before, but absolutely, yes. Things
Right.
as minor as backing your car into the driveway or in the garage so that you can make a quick escape, making sure that your driver's door is unlocked all the time, making sure there's fuel in the car if you have to use the car.
To
Um,
this day, believe it or not, Dave, to this day, my keys are still always in my car.
mhm.
Parked in the driveway right now, my keys are in my car. And it's a habit that I cultivated, and it's also convenient. I always know where my keys are. Now, could someone come and steal my car? Probably yes, but realistically, that's less likely to happen.
Yeah.
It's not likely to happen. But yeah, it's a good, even if you keep your extra key somewhere hidden in your car.
And let's talk about a go bag, a bag that we have ready, that if we are going to escape, we have everything that we need long term. Even if it doesn't necessarily mean long term, but a few days, a few weeks. So I'm going to just name off a few things that are on this list that I used to tell people all the time, and I put it on a list because like I said, I can't remember every single thing. There's so many
Yeah.
issues and dynamics about this, but birth certificates and social security cards, driver's license and passports if you need it, marriage and divorce or custody papers, which are critical important. If you're running to law enforcement and you've got the kids with you and he's calling law enforcement and saying she kidnapped my kids, you need to have custody orders if you have them that show that you do have the right to those kids. Um, Legal protection and restraining orders, if you already have them. If you don't, make sure you know what the procedures are to go get custody papers or temporary
Protection
restraining orders or restraining orders, long-term restraining orders, health insurance cards, medical records, immunization records. The car title registration and insurance documentation should be in the car. Cash, make sure you've got a bundle of cash somewhere. If you can collect that, put it in your go bag. Prepaid cell phone, as I've talked about before, hide cell phones as much as you can. Your medications, your prescriptions, make sure that those are with you when you run. So have some extras of that. If you can collect that or get your doctor to give you an emergency stash of your medications. And that's kind of hard today with the regulations of health
Yeah.
insurance companies and things like that. But it's something to be mindful of. Clothing, obviously, keepsakes that you think that you absolutely have to have, or things that the kids would need, like a special teddy bear or blanket or things like that. And a spare set of keys, like you just mentioned. What if he does find the keys in the car and takes them out? And now he's got control of the keys. Do you have a spare somewhere that you can still use that car? Those types of things. And then this is the danger part of it, and the caveat that I wanted to throw out there is that you are at danger. So make sure where you hide that bag is somewhere that you know he will never find it.
And this may be where a neighbor comes into play, or a post office box, or a safety deposit box, something
True.
like that sometimes as well.
Absolutely. Right.
One thing that I learned, and is that there's a mentality that you have to have about these types of relationships, and it is smile and nod and back away slowly, or turn and run. And
Mhm.
sometimes it's smile and nod and back away slowly until you can turn and run,
Yep.
right? So one of the most difficult things I think for people who are putting together their safety plan and their go bag and getting all this preparation, one of the hardest parts is continuing to play the role of the victim they want you to be.
Right.
Smile and nod. They have to think that absolutely nothing has changed. They cannot recognize that you're suspiciously making photocopies of birth certificates and things like that. So it's, yes, this is a very difficult process. We don't want to sugarcoat any of this, but we also believe that the more you know and the more you have awareness of, it's easier to maintain a clear head while when you have to exit.
There's one last thing I want to close with. I know we're over time, but there's a lethality aspect to this, as we've mentioned. I want you to do your own assessment of lethality and ask yourselves these three. There's a whole list of 11 things on a lethality checklist, and that kind of signifies whether or not you are in danger of serious bodily injury or death. But ask yourselves these questions. Has your partner ever used a weapon against you or threatened you with a weapon? Number two, has he or she ever threatened to kill you or your children? And number three, do you think he or she might try to kill you? And if any one of those three things exist, you need to get out of that relationship as quickly and as safely as you possibly can.
Yeah.
I could run down the list, but I think what I'll do is send this list to you, RC, so that you can post it.
Yep.
Because these are important aspects that we need to get out of our denial and recognize when we are in really bad danger, how far along that danger aspect of the explosive end of things has progressed. And this lethality checklist helps us do that.
And I will tell you, and this is nothing new. This is said. This has been said a lot, and I think that we really need to hammer this home. He will He'll scream at the TV or the video games before he'll hit you. He'll punch the wall before he'll hit you. He'll kick the dog before he'll hit you. But if
Mm.
he's doing any of those things, he will hit you. It
That's true.
will happen. It will happen. It will never stop at him punching a hole in the wall or throwing the remote control at the TV or kicking the dog or screaming at the neighbor's dog, even, right? Like it starts, if the aggression is there, it will expand. And there is no telling whether that expansion will accelerate in a week's time, a month's time, a year's time, or a decade. It does. It is the second you see a form of uncontrolled aggression, right? Uncontrolled, like, you can be angry in a relationship. You don't have to
Mhm.
hit things and punch things to control. If you can't control your anger and you even have to, you punch the coffee table or a pillow or a couch, that is a sign of violence of someone who is incapable of controlling their actions and their emotions.
The other one that I want to mention too, I keep thinking of things is strangulation. So if he's ever put his hands or she's put her hands around your neck and applied any level of pressure, um, and I'm not talking about the in the erotic sense. I'm
Right.
talking about in the danger of domestic violence sense. That is a strong, strong indicator that they have no problem with increasing that pressure and trying to kill you that way, or actually making you go unconscious. If that has ever happened, that is one of the things on that lethality checklist. Do you think he or she ever will try to kill you? If they've done that before, the answer is yes, because the level of danger increases by about 20 to 25% if they've ever used strangulation as a method. The other one is the pets. You've brought that up. Pets can be used just like children as tools, as weapons to harm you and to manipulate you and threaten you.
And it's also it has a lot to do with too, there's and it we can re-victimization, and the reason why we're often exposed to re-victimization, whether it's from the same abuser or whatnot. That's a master class for another day. We will be doing that one, I promise. But one of the components of re-victimization is something called flags and boosts. And the flags are psychographics and psychological indicators that oftentimes a victim gives off unknowingly. These are just, ways we hold our body, ways we talk, things like that, and they become subconscious indicators to perpetrators that we may be vulnerable. The other side of that is boosts, and this is the psychological phenomenon that someone who commits crimes or moral indiscretions. This could be someone who has stolen a pack of gum from a convenience store and then went, oh, I didn't get caught. Okay, well, I'm going to get a candy bar next time. And then the next time I'm going to be stealing a case of beer. And then before you know it, that person is, doing 20 to life for armed robbery because they robbed a bank, right? That's boosts. When someone gets away with small things for a long time, it does boost their confidence to continue to escalate that. And when you're talking about someone who um, commits aggressive or violent, right? Aggressive and violent, we often, I really think that they are one and the same, but I think that we separate them. But if someone is committing aggressive acts and it's, you know, taunting the dog a little too long, right? Playing rough with the dog a little too long or getting a little too aggressive there, they are testing. They're testing what it feels like to be aggressive and abusive. They're testing you to see what your threshold is for, you know, whether what your reaction is. What's your threshold? What's your tolerance for uncertainty? And
For intervention and for reporting.
yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah,
So that also brings up this concept too of documentation of the abuse throughout the relationship. If you recognize that much of what we've talked about here and those signs and symptoms of what abuse really is are occurring in your relationship, start documenting it. Keep a journal. Write down quotes, because oftentimes you hear very explicit kind of comments that are really implicit, and that is, if I were you, I'd kind of watch what's going on behind you when you're at the grocery store. If I were you, and little comments like that of if I were yous, and hey, have you ever thought that maybe this could happen to you? those types of, have you ever thought that maybe your brakes won't work one day? Those types
They
of
will, they, that's a really interesting thing. This is talked about with narcissists a lot, but one of those signs and symptoms is they often confess through accusation. And what I
Mhm.
mean is they'll accuse you of doing the thing they're about to do,
It's
right? If
true.
they accuse you of cheating, they're about to go do that. If they accuse you of being controlling, a control freak, pushing them, shoving, they're about to do that,
Or they have been doing
or
it
they've been doing it.
and you haven't recognized it. So in that documentation phase, make sure you write down as many quotes as possible, dates, times, locations.
Photos, if you can take photos of marks they put on your body or holes in the wall or things like that
If you
as
can turn on the
wonderful.
recording aspect of your phone, that little native app of the recorder that is on most phones now, if you can turn that on, turn it on.
It may
If
not
you
be
do feel
admissible
safe,
in court, but it may not be admissible in court, but it may be able to be used to validate your experience to law enforcement or even to your friend or your neighbor or your sister
right?
who can't believe that this person could do that to you, right? That there is a whole other psychological component to that.
It's a great piece of evidence for an investigating first responder or a detective who's doing follow-up. Like you said, it may not be evidence that they can use in court, but it certainly is evidence of trends and indicators that law enforcement can put together. And some states have very lenient statutes in place that will allow for exceptions to the normal rules as far as evidence is concerned in
Right.
domestic violence.
That's amazing.
Previous
Uh,
similarities are one of those others, so it's good to document.
Awesome. Well, Dave, we are definitely over time, which is indicating to me that because this conversation is so important, we may need to do a part two, where we can kind of do a deep dive into, like we said, talking about revictimization, the different psychographics and psychological indicators of both perpetrators and victims. More so in victims and how you can self-identify and know whether you are stuck in something. Because a lot of times, um, when we are in these situations, we are stuck in survival mode, and survival mode physiologically and neurologically in our brain puts blinders on. It makes us very short-sighted, which means we can only really see, a few minutes, maybe a day ahead of ourselves. It's very difficult to plan for the future when we are in this state. Abusers know this, they're very aware of this. And it also sort of erases our memory of the past. So we often um, downplay past experiences thinking they weren't that bad because we are stuck very much in the survival of now. So, thank you, Dave, so much. Is there anything else in closing that we want to touch on here? But I do think that we need a part two as well.
Well, I think one of the things that I would strongly encourage people to do is take whatever measures you have to take to stay safe. These are great recommendations of how possibly to start moving towards getting out of these relationships, but doing so in a very safe manner. And I just want to emphasize that that should be first and foremost in your mind. And if staying in that relationship for the time being is safer than leaving, then stay in the relationship, tolerate it like you have been, do whatever you need to do to document it and keep yourself safe from serious bodily injury or death. The other thing I want to mention that we will probably need to talk about in our future conversations about this is the overlap between domestic violence and rape and sexual assault, and how that is part of the domestic violence aspect. We didn't touch on that at all, and I
We
think it's an
did
important
not. And yeah, it's a huge conversation. And I think the conversation that kind of also ties into is this idea of re-victimization. So if you're watching this now and if we've already recorded that, then you can check that out here or wherever it is that video is about to pop up. You can check in the description as well. We'll make sure that there is a link to that or to any follow-ups for that. And we will be sure that there are links to all of the resources that we mentioned tonight, checklists, safety plans, and even some of the graphics that we described tonight, so that you can study them more and really determine whether you are in an abusive relationship and what you need to do to get out of it. So Thank you so much, Dave, for being here. Thank you, everyone who stuck around late tonight. I appreciate that. This is a very, very important conversation. So,
Well,
um,
thank you, Marcy. It's been an honor and a pleasure to be here. Not a pleasure in the sense that this is a fun topic to talk about, but a pleasure that you've opened up the platform the way you have and made this an important aspect of what it means to be a part of Survivor School. And I'm really thankful that Survivor School exists and that you are doing what you're doing. Don't stop. You're saving lives. So thank you.
Thank you. And I'm very, very grateful for all of the experts that have stepped up to bring their knowledge and expertise and insights to bring this information. It's important. And that's the entire goal of Survivor School, is to make sure that survivors get the resources that they need. So
Absolutely.
awesome. All right, everyone. Thank you so much. Have a great night. Bye-bye.
Bye.